20th century America, far too little honored, in fact, barely even remembered, was H.A. Muskie, America's foremost pacifist, as he's described by Taylor Branch in his magisterial history of the King years. The King himself credited Muskie with having taught him and others the meaning of nonviolence. He's the mentor of the nonviolent movement in the United States. And I don't have to add that Dr. King pursued the course that Muskie outlined with immense courage and integrity. It's described in inspiring and painful detail in Taylor Branch's study. Muskie himself, he was a dedicated pacifist, but of a special kind. He advocated what he called revolutionary pacifism. Muskie disdained the kind of pacifism that would be satisfied with peace without justice. Quote his own words, he said that one must be a revolutionary before one can be a pacifist, by which he meant that we must cease to acquiesce in evil conditions and must deal honestly and adequately with this 90% of our problem, the violence on which the present system is based and all the evil, material and spiritual, that this entails for the masses of men throughout the world. And unless we do so, he went on, there's something ludicrous and perhaps hypocritical about our concern over the 10% of the violence employed by the rebels against oppression, no matter how hideous they may be. At the time that he spoke those words, he was facing what may be the hardest test for a pacifist, namely whether to support U.S. participation in the anti-fascist war after the Japanese attack on U.S. military bases in Pearl Harbor and Manila. I wrote about Muskie's stand 45 years ago while the Indochina wars were raging, and then I quoted his warning that the problem after a war is with the victor. He thinks he has just proven that war and violence pay. Who will teach him a lesson? That observation was all too apt at the time and all too many occasions before and regrettably since. Well, we all know that Dr. King and other leaders of the civil rights movement struggled hard with serious dilemmas as they searched for ways to move beyond the achieving minimal rights for African Americans in the South, which was hard enough, onto broader questions about peace and justice. The most urgent issues at the time were the Vietnam War and poverty. And the leadership understood very well that if they brought up these issues, the support for the civil rights efforts would significantly erode among Northern liberals in particular. And so it happened, in fact, when King decided, nevertheless, to proceed on the course of revolutionary pacifism. And the miserable slums in Chicago, the atrocious wars in Indochina, and to the Poor People's Movement that he was trying to organize when he was assassinated here in Memphis, supporting the sanitation workers' strike, record that's described in painful and poignant detail in a book that I just learned about yesterday. Jacob gave it to me, Michael Honey's book which focuses on the last years of King's life, primarily the sanitation workers' strike, and indeed what happened after the assassination when the march began in the Lorraine Motel on through the regions where the civil rights struggle had taken place, and on finally to Washington, where the Poor People's Movement was scorned by Congress and routed measure destroyed Resurrection City in the middle of the night under orders from some of the most liberal governments we've ever had, worth remembering. It's no less painful to ask about the status of these issues today. Let's take poverty. Poverty now stands at a near record level, record heights. It's particularly awful for African Americans. Their net worth, the total assets of the African American community, is now 1/20th of whites. That's the lowest level it's been since studies were ever undertaken. It's literally at zero for about a third of blacks and Hispanics. Barely different. It's barely $5,000 of total assets on average. That's the latest chapter in an awful history, which is not really well enough known. Recall that the first slaves were brought here by the Pilgrims almost 500 years ago, and also worth remembering, if unfortunately not well enough known, that the concern to protect slavery was a leading factor. Some historians argue the major factor leading to the Revolutionary War. British law was moving very visibly at the time towards a harsh condemnation of slavery as an intolerable practice. The most prominent British jurist, Lord Mansfield, in 1770 condemned it as an odious practice that can't be tolerated in civilized countries. And there was a lot of fear in the colonies, the American colonies, that the laws might extend here if British domination remained. That was quite clearly a significant factor in the Revolutionary War. Well, the slaves remained. Civil War technically ended slavery, and formally did. And in fact, for about 10 years, there was formal freedom in the South, where the great majority of African Americans lived. It lasted for 10 years. At that point, there was a North-South compact, which effectively allowed the criminalization of black life. And that restored conditions comparable to slavery, in many ways worse. The American Industrial Revolution, to a substantial extent, the late 19th century, to a substantial extent, was based on what amounted to slave labor. It criminalized black labor in the South. That continued until the Second World War, when there was a need for free labor for war industries. After the war, there was a brief period, and economists call it the golden age of capitalism. New Deal measures were in place, popular activism had changed the society. The 50s and the 60s were the greatest growth period in history. And there were opportunities during those years. So it was possible, say, for a black man to get a job in the auto industry, make a reasonably decent salary, buy a home, kids to college, that sort of thing. That lasted approximately 20 years. It ended in the 1970s when there was a radical shift in the economy by design, shifting the economy that took from the late 1970s, accelerated under Reagan, shifting it to financialization and moving of production offshore, very profitable for the owners and the banks and the managers and so on, but a disaster for the population. And it created a superfluous population, the population of the workforce. There's a close race-class correlation in the United States, so it was particularly harmful for the black population. But what do you do with a superfluous population? There's a method in our client states in Latin America. It's called social cleansing. What you do is send out the paramilitaries to murder, but we're more humane here, so we don't do that. We send them to jail. And since 1980, as I'm sure you know, in 1980, the incarceration rate in the United States was approximately like other industrial countries. Crime rates are also approximately like other countries. Now it's about, the incarceration rate is 5 to 10 times as high as other countries, the highest in any country where there are statistics that mean anything, and it's pretty horrible. The treatment in American prisons are an international scandal. The major technique that's been used has been the drug war, which is too fraudulent to talk about. But if you look over the record, you think about it for a minute, in half a millennium, there have been about 30 years of relative freedom and a degree of opportunity for the original slave population and their descendants. And Martin Luther King's aspirations remain very remote, much to our shame. Well, what about the Vietnam War, the other major issue of the time? That's also worth some reflection. Right now, we're quite properly celebrating the anniversary, the 30th anniversary of the Center. And indeed, significant anniversaries are regularly celebrated or sometimes solemnly commemorated, like Pearl Harbor, for example. There are other anniversaries which are ignored, and we can often learn quite a lot from them, about ourselves, and indeed about what's likely to lie ahead, unless significant changes take place in our society and, in fact, our culture. So take right now, this moment. We're failing to commemorate the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's decision to launch the most destructive and murderous act of aggression of the post-Second World War period, namely the invasion of South Vietnam, decided just 50 years ago, later extended to all of Indochina, left millions of people dead, 4 countries devastated. The casualties are still mounting today from the long-term effects of drenching South Vietnam with some of the most lethal carcinogens that are known. It was known at the time. That was part of the program that Kennedy authorized 50 years ago to carry out chemical warfare to destroy ground cover and crops, food crops. For the Vietnamese today, the war is very far from over. The prime target throughout was South Vietnam. The aggression later spread to the north. Then it went on to remote peasant societies in northern Laos, a horrifying attack that had very little to do with the Vietnam War. And finally it went on to rural Cambodia 40 years ago. Rural Cambodia, very poor peasant society, was bombed at the stunning level of all Allied operations in the Pacific Theater in the Second World War, including 2 atom bombs. Rural Cambodia. That was under orders transmitted from President Nixon by his aide, Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger's words were to the Air Force, "Anything that flies on anything that moves." Now that's a call for genocide that's very rare in the historical record. In fact, I might try to find a counterpart. Very little of this is remembered, except by the victims. Most was scarcely known at the time beyond very narrow circles of activists, and the basic information, though public in released documents, has never been reported in the United States, except way at the margins. Well, when the invasion was launched 50 years ago, concern about these topics was so slight that there were almost no efforts at justification, hardly more than the President Kennedy's impassioned address to the UN General Assembly, where he warned, quote him, that we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. And if the conspiracy achieves its ends in Laos and Vietnam, the gates will be opened wide. If you think George Bush and company were lying about Iraq, it doesn't come close to this, and they knew it. There was no self-deception. At the same time, he elsewhere warned that The complacent, the self-indulgent, the soft societies are about to be swept away with the debris of history, and only the strong can possibly survive. In this case, he was lamenting the failure of U.S. aggression and large-scale terror to crush Cuban independence. Well, no protest, no concern. But years later, protest against the Vietnam War finally did develop. About a half a dozen years later, it was noticeable. At that point, the respected Vietnam specialist, military historian, Bernard Fall, who incidentally was no dove, he forecast by then that Vietnam, as a cultural and historic entity, is threatened with extinction as the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. And he was again referring to South Vietnam, the worst, the most heavily attacked throughout until Cambodia. 8 horrendous years later, the war finally ended. At that time, mainstream opinion was divided between those who regarded the war as a noble cause, Reagan's phrase and others, a cause that could have been won if there had been more dedication. And then there was the opposite extreme, the critics, to whom it was a mistake that proved too costly. It's, by 1977, President Carter aroused almost no notice when he explained that we owe Vietnam no debt because the destruction was mutual. No comment. At that time, interestingly, the population here, as radically distinct from educated sectors, had a very different conception. About 70% of the population regarded the war as not a mistake, but fundamentally wrong and immoral. That's out of history. Remained that way as long as questions were raised. Exactly what people meant by that, we don't actually know, because the pollsters were so incapable, good liberal scholars, I should say, were so incapable of comprehending the words that they never asked. All we know is the numbers. You make of them what you like. Well, in this case, too, the hopes and dreams of Musty and King remain very remote. Actually, right now, we are failing to commemorate the 50th anniversary of an even more remarkable event, one of truly historic importance, namely Vatican II. It's the council called by Pope John XXIII, which ushered in a new era in the history of the Catholic Church, quoting the words of the distinguished theologian and historian of Christianity, Hans Küng, called it an epoch-making turning point in the history of the Church. He thought, or he hoped, it would be irrevocable. And it's of particular significance for us. Vatican II was an attempt to revive the Gospels with their radical pacifist message, actually the message that inspired Musty and King. And here in Memphis, the message that inspired the Memphis bishop, who was one of the founders of Pax Christi in the USA. The radical pacifism of the Gospels is the reason why Christians were so bitterly persecuted in the first few centuries after Christ. In fact, until the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, and the cross, which had been the symbol of the suffering of the persecuted, found its place on the shields of the Roman legions. Hans Küng has a description of that too in his History of Christianity. He said the church of the persecuted became the church of the persecutors. 1962 was a major change, or an effort at a major change. Pope John XXIII, 50 years ago, made a really valiant effort to reunite the church and the Gospels, not just in talk, that's easy, but in actual meaning. The church under his direction was to adopt the preferential option for the poor, the message of the Gospels. It was taken particularly seriously in Latin America. Latin American bishops, priests, nuns, lay people that went out into the countryside trying to bring to poor peasant communities the actual meaning of the Gospels, not just repeating the words, not thinking about them, but thinking about what they actually mean, this radical pacifist message, and trying to help them to organize, to overcome what Chomsky had called, I'll quote again, the violence on which the present system is based, and all the evil, material and spiritual, that this entails for the masses of men throughout the world. And this is in our backyard in Latin America, where the violence and the misery were particularly acute, again, much to our shame. Well, the U.S. reacted to this at once. It launched a major war to crush the heresy. An extraordinary plague of repression spread over Latin America, worse than anything in its terrible history. It finally reached Central America under the murderous Reagan regime, and naturally included a long stream of religious martyrs. One of them was Rutilio Grande, 1977, parish priest in El Salvador. He was assassinated along with 2 co-workers, collateral damage. That deeply affected Archbishop Romero. He'd been appointed archbishop because he was a conservative bishop, so he was considered safe. But when his parish priests were being assassinated by the U.S.-backed terrorist forces, state terrorist forces, he was affected, particularly by Rutilio Grande's murder, and he became what was called in El Salvador the voice for the voiceless. He adopted the lessons of the Gospels preached by Vatican II. Well, his voice was silenced very quickly in 1980. He was assassinated while he was reading Mass by pretty much the same groups coming straight out of the U.S.-backed state terrorist forces. He was assassinated just days after he had sent a passionate letter to President Carter appealing to him to withhold aid from the military junta, because he said that the aid that the U.S. is sending would be used to crush the people's most elementary human rights, which was true. That's what it was being used for. Well, he pleaded in vain. He was assassinated. It continued. That set off a decade of mass murder and torture in El Salvador. It was even worse in Guatemala, where incidentally people are still fleeing from the Guatemalan islands today, from the wreckage of the virtual genocide that was carried out there. It wasn't quite as bad in Nicaragua. It was bad enough. Not quite as bad because in Nicaragua the population had an army to defend it from the U.S.-run terrorist forces. In the other countries of Central America, the army itself were the terrorist forces. That continued until 1989, November 1989, about the same time as the Berlin Wall fell. The most recent religious martyrs were assassinated. 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, in the university Jesuit University in El Salvador. They were murdered by an elite U.S.-run, U.S.-armed battalion, Placado Brigade, which already had a horrendous tale of bloody murder behind it through the decade. Usual victims, peasants, human rights workers, priests, and so on. They were just returning from renewed training at the John F. Kennedy School of Special Warfare in North Carolina. They just came back. They got orders from the High Command. We have the orders, of course they're not published here. The High Command was in close contact with the American Embassy, ordered them to go into the university, get rid of these rebellious priests, blow their brains out, and also had to kill anyone who was around so they would meeting witnesses, so they killed their housekeeper and her daughter. Now, that was November 1989. That's not quite the end of the U.S. war against the church. It continued. One of the most important recent events was in 2004, when the U.S. and France invaded Haiti. They're the two traditional torturers of Haiti. They kidnapped the president, who keeps being reelected, liberation theologist. Every time there's anything remotely like a fair election, he's easily elected. So therefore, he has to be overthrown. In this case, France and the United States, with the help of Canada, invaded, kidnapped him, sent him off to Central Africa. That wouldn't let him return to the hemisphere. And his political party is not permitted to participate in elections out of fear that they're going to win once again. They've won every time there's been anything remotely like a free election. So another liberation theologist gotten rid of. In this case, didn't have his brains blown out. It's just prevented from participating in the political system. Well, all of this is forgotten. George Orwell coined the useful term unpeople. That's for creatures who kind of look like human beings, but aren't fit to be admitted into the human species. And we can add another word, unhistory, for historical events that aren't fit to be admitted into the historical record. There are all too many of them. These are examples which I mentioned because of the 50th anniversary happens to be right now, and one that's extremely significant for us and therefore unhistory. Well, the attempt to revive the Gospels and their message of revolutionary pacifism after 1,600 years, almost 1,600 years, that reveals all too clearly that it can take a long, long time for lessons that threaten power to be permitted to enter into history or even into consciousness or memory. And this is, after all, the fundamental element of what's called Western culture. But while the causes may sometimes languish, they don't die. It's true of every single case. Even the failures and the defeats leave a legacy. It's true of the destruction of the Poor People's March and the destruction of Restoration City as well. And that left a legacy. There's another striking example. We'll move ahead a couple of years. In a few years, we should be at least commemorating the 8th century anniversary of the Magna Carta, 1215. It's a huge step forward in advocacy of human rights 8 centuries ago. It's of particular significance to us today. One part of it of almost unique significance is Article 39 of the Great Charter. It should be read in schools everywhere. It says that no free man shall be deprived of rights except by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. That established the basis for what's called the presumption of innocence and the right to speedy jury trial. It's the foundation of Anglo-American law. It was a major step forward in principle. Well, the charter was very quickly rescinded by the Pope, who was a very powerful figure at the time. But in later years, it was revived, and it was broadened. It expanded free men to men, just men, and it added the right of habeas corpus. It crossed the Atlantic, and it entered the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which declared that no person can be deprived of rights without due process. That includes the right to a speedy and public trial, reaffirmed in the 14th Amendment right after the Civil War. Well, the fate of Article 39 of the Great Charter is highly instructive. It refers to the word person throughout, including the Constitution and 14th Amendment. But of course, the Founding Fathers, that didn't mean person when they used the word person. So, for example, the indigenous population were unpeople. They were not persons. You could do anything to them you wanted, exterminate them, drive them away. No process of law was relevant. Didn't refer to slaves. In fact, they were defined in the Constitution as unpersons, 3/5 human. And the purpose of that was to allow the slave owners to get extra votes. It didn't include women. They were barred from voting. In fact, even barred from jury duty. But one of the great achievements of the civil rights movement of the 1960s was, for the first time, to establish that women have the right to participate in juries. The right to vote came in the early 20s, incidentally about the same time that women in Afghanistan got the right to vote. So the concept person didn't include people, free men of insufficient property, because there were all kinds of restrictions on voting rights. But since the 14th Amendment, the term has been both broadened and narrowed by the courts. So about a century ago, the courts extended the concept person to collectivist legal fictions, as they're called in the legal literature, which are established and sustained by state power, meaning corporations. Their rights as persons were, in fact, the cases brought under the 14th Amendment, which were intended to refer to freed slaves, almost never did, almost entirely to corporations. The rights of corporations have been greatly expanded, for example, by the trade agreements like NAFTA, far beyond personal rights. So, for example, under NAFTA and other trade agreements, if a corporation, say General Motors, invests in Mexico, they have to be granted national rights, the rights of a Mexican business. If a Mexican comes to the United States and asks for national rights, we don't have to talk about it. They were extended even further by the, just mentioned, by the Citizens United decision, which actually follows an earlier decision, Buckley v. Valeo, to include money as speech. So you know about Citizens United, I won't talk about it, but that, we can't really say that that grants the right of private capital to buy elections, because they've always had that right. And in fact, if you look through history, you can pretty well predict the policies of an administrative government simply by looking at the coalition of investors that gets together to fund the campaign. There's very good work on this by Thomas Ferguson, political economist in Massachusetts. Should be read if you haven't read it. Citizens United and Buckley v. Valeo expand that. We can see on the front pages in the TV news every day how far it's expanded. Well, the concept of person is also narrowed by the courts. For example, it has to exclude undocumented aliens. Now, they may look like people, but they're excluded by law from the category of persons. They're unpersons. So the courts have determined, with the support of the government and unfortunately the majority of the public, something else we ought to contemplate. Meanwhile, the presumption of innocence, which traced them right to a speedy trial, which traced back to Magna Carta, they've been tossed so far out the window that they become virtually invisible. And so take a couple of actual examples. One example, which is telling, is the first Guantanamo case to come to what's called trial under the Obama administration. Trial means military court. It's not a trial by any meaningful standard. First case was Omar Khadr. Interesting case. Tells us a lot about ourselves. Omar Khadr was a 15-year-old child who was charged with having tried to defend his village in Afghanistan when it was attacked by American soldiers. Makes him a terrorist. So he was brought to the Bagram torture center, then sent to Guantanamo, spent 8 years there. Finally, after 8 years, he was granted a hearing at a military tribunal, a military court, not exactly what the Magna Carta had in mind. And he was given a choice. He could plead not guilty and stay there in Guantanamo or some similar place for the rest of his life, or he could plead guilty and spend another 8 years in Guantanamo. I'll tell you what that's like. Well, his lawyers advised him to plead guilty, so technically he pleaded guilty. He's a Canadian citizen. If the Canadian government dared to step on the toes of the master, which they don't, they could extradite him and free him. But he'll spend 16 years in prison as a convicted terrorist, pleaded guilty of trying to defend his village when it was attacked when he was 15 years old. I'm sure you know the case of Bradley Manning. It's been kept, I guess it's 1.5 years now, in most of the time under what amounts to torture. Now in a military prison, facing a military tribunal finally, but again, no trial. Or the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was murdered under Obama's orders in Yemen, an American citizen in this case. There was also some collateral damage. Another American citizen happened to be with him. He was killed too. There were headlines about it. The New York Times had a headline saying, "West celebrates cleric's death." Actually, it wasn't just death, it was assassination. There was a little controversy in that case because he was an American citizen, as was the other person who was killed. And they're supposed to have some residual rights that kind of resemble persons. But you want to kill others who aren't American citizens, just do it freely. The presumption of innocence is out the window. A rather striking case was the assassination of Osama bin Laden. Remember, he was apprehended, totally defenseless. He was apprehended, then under orders from the government, murdered, body thrown into the sea, so there was no autopsy. The reaction to that was pure celebration. The idea that the suspect, and whatever you think about him, he was a suspect, and under the long-forgotten concept of presumption of innocence, a suspect is innocent unless brought to trial, speedy trial, and convicted, which certainly could be done. But no, it wasn't done. Pure celebration. There were a couple of remarks that questioned the propriety of this, and that's considered virtual treason. And there are some interesting reactions to the few cases. My favorite one is by a very highly respected left liberal commentator, Matthew Iglesias. He patiently explained, I'll quote him, that one of the main functions of the international institutional order is precisely to legitimate the use of deadly military force by Western powers. That means the United States. So that's, I'll read again, the function of the international institutional order is precisely to legitimate the use of deadly force, military force by the United States. So he went on to say that it's amazingly naive to suggest that the United States should observe the law, or in fact any other conditions that we impose on the powerless. We can only raise maybe tactical objections if the United States invades other countries, murders and destroys with abandon, assassinates suspects at will, and otherwise fulfills what are called its obligations in the service of mankind. And if the traditional victims see the matter somewhat differently, that just reveals their moral and intellectual backwardness. And as for the very rare Western critic who fails to comprehend these fundamental truths, they can be dismissed in Iglesias' work as silly. Incidentally, he's referring to specifically to me, and I very carefully, very happily confess my guilt. Well, again, this is the left end of the spectrum of the of intellectual opinion. It's not, say, the electoral farce that you can watch on television daily. It's called the Republican primaries. Just a couple of weeks ago, President Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act. There's a lot of discussion about that. It is a regressive step, but we should pay attention to what it does if you read it. The act essentially codifies into law what has been standard practice, the Bush practice adopted by President Obama of holding what are called enemy combatants under indefinite detention without trial. The NDAA now mandates that for non-citizens and permits it for citizens, doesn't mandate. What's an enemy combatant? That's a new concept, doesn't have status in international law, Bush concept. Enemy combatant is anyone the government alleges to be part of the so-called war on terror, like this 15-year-old boy who allegedly tried to defend his village when it was attacked. Effectively, that means anyone they choose, because the government's kind of like Humpty Dumpty. The words mean what they decide they're going to mean, terror as well. Well, without proceeding, and there's a lot to say, the core principles of the Magna Carta, 8 centuries later, that not only remain very far from fulfillment, but they're receding from sight. It's a very significant fact. Actually, this is not the only, or maybe even the worst, attack on civil rights under the Obama administration. There's a competitor for the prize. It was one that was, it's an innovation of Obama, or Holder, the Justice Department. It's a case that you should look at. It's Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project. The Humanitarian Law Project is an organization that gives advice on legal matters pretty freely. The case was brought by the Obama administration. It was argued for the administration by Elena Kagan, who is Obama's most recent appointment to the Supreme Court. They won. The case is extremely important and very ominous. It takes a step forward. There had been legal, so-called laws, I don't believe in them, but they're laws, saying that criminalizing, providing what's called material support to what are called terrorists, that's already illegal. The Holder of the Humanitarian Law Project went a step forward. It said advice counts as material support. That means many of us could be put in jail for this right now. If you give advice to someone on the terrorist list, urging them to undertake nonviolent means, or if you give them legal advice, that's material support for terrorism under this new law. I should say that this was immediately implemented right after this Supreme Court decision. The government sent the FBI to raid apartments in Minneapolis and Chicago, to claiming that the people there were giving material support, maybe advice, like advice to turn to nonviolence, to groups on the terrorist list. This places really ominous powers in the hands of the federal government, and really with few constraints, when even the foundations of Anglo-American law from 8 centuries ago are being cast to the wind. I should say a word about the terrorist list. What's that? It shouldn't exist in a free society. The terrorist list simply is an executive decision to call somebody a terrorist. No review, no evidence, no defense. Just the president announces you're a terrorist, or Mahara, for example, and there's no recourse. And the history of this is pretty revealing. So we happen to be anniversary that should be commemorating right now is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the African National Congress, Mandela's African National Congress. In 1988, pretty recently, the White House, Reagan's White House, condemned the African National Congress as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That allowed the Reagan administration to continue to support the apartheid regime, by that time even violating congressional sanctions, and it was justified under Reagan's war on terror. There's an illusion that George Bush declared the war on terror. Actually, he didn't. He redeclared it when Reagan came in 20 years earlier. His administration quickly announced that a core element of U.S. policy would be to get rid of what they called the plague of international terrorism, a return to barbarism in the modern age. That's kind of wiped out of history because, in fact, it quickly turned into a horrendous terrorist war. So you know, that's unhistory, but it happened. And part of it was support for the apartheid regime. You had to defend it against one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world, the African National Congress. In fact, Nelson Mandela himself was just removed from the terrorist list about 2 years ago. He can now come to the United States without special dispensation. It's not the only case. Right now, there's the 30th anniversary of another striking case, 1982. In 1982, the Reagan administration removed one country from the terrorist list, namely Iraq. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was removed from the terrorist list because Washington wanted to provide it with support, aid in its attack on Iran. And in fact, you may recall a year after they were removed from the terrorist list, they're not terrorists anymore. And that allowed the United States to participate and to support Saddam Hussein right through his worst atrocities. The campaign against the Kurds, the use of chemical weapons, always supported by the Reagan administration because he wasn't an international terrorist. Saddam, they finally decided they didn't like him anymore, and he was captured and brought to trial, and he was tried for crimes committed in 1982, the year the United States took him off the terrorist list. And I'm sure they picked that year because the crimes for which he was tried, which were bad enough, were like a toothpick on a mountain compared with his crimes. They couldn't allow the other ones to come in because the U.S. was supporting them. So they're on history. That's 1982. Didn't end there. In 1989, when the war with Iran was over, this is now President Bush #1, President Bush invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. It's 1989. 1990, early 1990, President Bush sent a high-level senatorial delegation to Iraq, led by Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole, later Republican presidential candidate. What they were supposed to do was to bring the president's message to his friend Saddam, explaining how much we admire him, and to inform Saddam that he should disregard the criticisms that he sometimes hears in the American press. We have this freedom of press business here, so it's impossible to silence them. The senators told Saddam that they would remove from the Voice of America somebody who was criticizing it. That was about 3 months before the invasion of Kuwait. So this has to be on history too. Saddam did make a mistake a couple of months after that. His first mistake, he either misunderstood or disobeyed orders. That doesn't work. So then everything changed, as you know. Well, that's all on history. Last in 1982, there was a gap in the terrorist list. Saddam Hussein had been removed, he had to fill it. So Cuba was added to the terrorist list in recognition of the fact that Cuba was the leading victim of international terrorism throughout the world, coming from the United States. And in the preceding several years, it had reached a peak with the shooting down of a Cuban airliner, killing 73 people, bombing of embassies, and so on. The people responsible for that ended up living quite happily in Florida. There is a doctrine called the Bush Doctrine, Bush number 2, which says that countries that harbor terrorists are as guilty as the terrorists themselves. But since the United States is self-declared to be immune to international law, including U.S. doctrines, that's not a problem. Well, that's the terrorist. It's easy to add other anniversaries. I won't go on. But let me just end by something we all remember, I'm sure. Dr. King's last address to sanitation workers here in Memphis. This is just hours before he was assassinated. He preached there that he had climbed the mountain. He could see the promised land, but he knew he was never going to get there. However, he promised the people he cared about, the poor and the persecuted, that they would finally reach the promised land someday. They're still waiting, and that dream, his most significant dream, remains